Welcome. My name is Mark Margolius. I'm Vice President of Faculty and Program at IJS, and we want to welcome you to this special evening, which features Rabbi Josh Fagelson in conversation with Rabbi Sharon Brous. And I'd like to take a couple of minutes before we start just to call your attention to a few of our upcoming programs you might be interested in as you look to cultivate or deepen your relationship to Jewish spiritual practice, whether individually or in shared company. First, we're thrilled to announce our fourth annual Evening of Gratitude, which will be on June 4th, Tuesday night, June 4th at 8 p.m. on Zoom. And it's commemorating the 30th anniversary of the seminal book, The Jew in the Lotus. And we'll be presenting author Roger Kamenetz, author of The Jew in the Lotus, as well as Jay Michelson in conversation with Jane Eisner. And we really couldn't be more excited to hold space for these incredible thinkers. Registration is open now. You can see the link in the chat. Reminder for those who know, and also just letting you know for those who don't, that our daily sits, daily meditations are held Monday through Friday, 12:30 Eastern on Zoom, free of charge. They're also live streamed on our YouTube channel. And we have monthly meditation space as well for LGBTQ plus folks and for Jews of color, free of charge. Check that out as well. We're delighted that we have a new offering, Shevet, which is our young adult mindfulness community. So if you're in your 20s or 30s and looking to nurture your capacity for compassion and resilience, and who isn't these days, it's a community that's really for you. And Shevet meets Mondays at 8 p.m., from 8 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And finally, Shema, which means hear, listen in Hebrew. That's a 5-week online program to help you cultivate your capacity to listen with deep and sacred awareness to yourself and to others. It's a course that will explore the 4 worlds of experience, exploring spirituality in the realms of the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, and the spiritual. You can feel free to check out the details of these and any other programs on our website, and the link is in the chat. And finally, today, just a reminder that our work at IJS is more important than ever. We count on support from people like you, which enables us to offer programs like tonight's event and to continue to expand our audience and increase our impact. So if you're moved to do so, please consider going to the link in the chat or to our website's donation page, jewishspirituality.org, to make a donation of any amount. And now let me introduce our program for tonight. Conducting tonight's interview is Rabbi Josh Fagelson, President and CEO of IJS. Josh joined us in February 2020 after serving as Dean of Students at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Josh's book is Eternal Questions, Reflections, Conversations, and Jewish Mindfulness Practices for the Weekly Torah portion, which is published by Ben Yehuda Press. And Josh tonight will be speaking with Rabbi Sharon Brous, who is the senior and founding rabbi of IKAR, which is a leading edge Jewish community based in Los Angeles, and author of The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Our Hearts and Mend Our Broken World. It's out now from Penguin Random House. In 2013, Sharon blessed Rabbi Obama and Vice President Biden at the inaugural National Prayer Service. In 2021, she returned to bless President Biden and Vice President Harris. She was named number 1 in the Newsweek Daily Beast list of most influential rabbis in America, has been recognized by the Forward, by the Jerusalem Post, as well as among the most influential Jews in the world. And her 2016 TED Talk, Reclaiming Religion, has been viewed by 1.5 million people, and she lives in Los Angeles with her husband and children. And before we begin, we'll drop a link in the chat for those who might be interested in purchasing Sharon's book, which is just sensational and important. And we really encourage you to, there it is. We really encourage you to purchase a copy of that. And I encourage you to ask questions during tonight's event. And to do that, you can just click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can address your questions to Q&A in the chat. Address those questions to Q&A. And with that, I'll turn things over to you, Josh.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. Sharon, thank you so much for making time and being here with us tonight. Really, really excited to have this conversation with you. Been looking forward to it for a long time. Have my copy right here. Want to re-up Mark's comments. If you haven't already bought the book, you should buy the book, um, and you should read it, and you should take it to heart. Um, so I wanted to start with Sharon. You said at one point in the book, you said that the title, and actually we should just clarify the title. Do you have a preference of, is it Amen, Amen, Amen? There's a lot of ways to pronounce this book. How do you like to pronounce it?
It depends on who I'm talking to. I kind of code switch based on who the audience is. So for this crowd, I'm guessing amen is the right way to say it.
Great.
We say amen, but part of what I loved about the name is that that the word amen appears in so many different traditions and is said in so many different ways. So amen, 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 amen. So I love that there's a resonance to this idea of responding to someone's blessing, responding to someone's pain or to their joy with our presence. And it's not only true in Judaism, but there are echoes of that in so many different traditions.
Yeah. Yeah.
But first of all, I just want to thank you. I'm so happy to be in this conversation with you. We've been looking forward to this for many months. And thank you to Mark also, and to all of you for being here tonight. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. So, so the Amen effect, the title you say in the book came from one of your early sermons at Ikar. And I'd love to hear more about that sermon and like how this book then came to be, other than obviously, you had an agent and an editor who said, hey, here's a book, but like, yeah, tell us more about how this book came to be.
Sure. So we started Ikar in the spring of 2004, and we really launched the community to stand at the intersection of the revitalization of Jewish spiritual practice and social justice, the work of building a more just and loving society. And we kind of went out of the gates, running. And we were working at such a fevered pitch in pursuit of those two objectives that it literally took me years to realize that I had never once given a sermon about how we in a Jewish community were actually obligated to show up for each other in times of heartache and in times of joy. It's such an obvious message. I had never given one sermon about that. And it wasn't one of the things that I thought I needed to teach about in the beginning. And there were certainly people in the community who were taking care of each other, who were showing up for each other in really extraordinary ways from the beginning. But I, as a rabbi, had totally missed the mark by not speaking directly to this point, that the way that we show up for each other in moments of heartache is actually definitional to who we are as a community and who we are as individuals, that our presence really matters. Often in times when it's hardest to show up for one another, when our deepest instinct is to retreat and to pull away and disincline, actually leaning into relationship in those moments are some of the most meaningful moments of our lives. So there was a Mishnah that I had first encountered when I was in seminary at JTS many years before. And when I first saw it, I was so struck by it, but I found it confounding because the context of this Mishnah, which comes from Midot, is really talking about the architectural layout of the Beit HaMikdash, of the Temple Mount, of the temple in Jerusalem. And this seemed to be speaking in almost a different language than the rest of the Mishnayot around it. It describes an encounter that would happen in a ritual at the Beit HaMikdash. I did not understand it. I photocopied that page in my Mishnah after spending, an hour or two just staring at it, trying to make sense of it. I photocopied it and I folded it up, put it back inside the book and put it back on my shelf. And then we flew out to LA. We started building this community, as I said, really focused on revitalizing Jewish spiritual practice and being good multi-faith partners in the work of building a more just and loving society. And one day, after about 10 years at Ikar, I happened to pull this Mishnah off my shelf, and I saw the text and I saw what the ritual is that it describes. And it just completely took my breath away, because at this point I had lived some more life. I had a few children, 3 to be precise. I had married people. I had helped people through divorce. I had buried people, sometimes after tragic loss. And suddenly the text and the ritual made sense to me in a way that it didn't before. So what it describes is that in ancient times, Jews from all around the land and the diaspora used to ascend to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage ritual. And they would go up to Jerusalem, the city on a hill. They would climb the steps of the Beit HaMikdash, the Temple Mount. They would enter through this giant arched entryway, and they would turn to the right, and they would circle around the courtyard of the Temple Mount en masse, hundreds of thousands of people at a time. And then they would leave basically where they had just entered, except the text says, for somebody to whom something had happened, Misha Erodavar, someone with a broken heart. And that person would still go up to the Temple Mount. They would still walk through the arched entryway, but they would turn to the left when everyone else turned to the right. And then this sacred encounter would occur when that individual would encounter the masses coming toward her. And what would happen is the people coming this way who saw this individual would look into their eyes and would ask them a simple question, Malach, tell me, what happened to you? Tell me about your broken heart. And the person would answer saying, my father just died and I'm torn up about it. Or I'm just worried sick about my kid and I need someone to tell me she's going to be okay. Or I found a lump, right? Whatever the pain was that person was holding in her heart. And the people who are going this way, who heard that message, would listen with care, would keep their eyes on this person, and then would offer a blessing. Something simple like, may the one who dwells in this place hold you with love as you navigate this difficult time. And that was it. That's the end of the encounter. And what I realized that was so powerful about it is that none of the parties in this ritual want to be participating in this ritual, because the person who's brokenhearted, who's bereft and bereaved and ill and lonely, doesn't even want to get out of bed most of the time, but instead shows up in this place and is willing to be vulnerable before this community, trusting that the community will hold her with tenderness. And the community that's going this way, I did a lot of research as I was writing the book about the Hajj, actually looking at what happens in Mecca when millions of pilgrims come from all around the world and they're walking together just the way that our ancestors did.
Hajj is the same word as Chag, right?
Yeah. Right. And people say it is the most profound spiritual experience of their lives, that as soon as they start moving like that, they burst into tears, their legs give out. They have this intense encounter with God because they're part of this massive community. The last thing you want to do, the most counter-instinctual thing for you to do when you're finally having that immense experience, is say to your friends and your family, like, hey, I'm just going to peel away for a minute because I see a stranger coming toward me with puffy red eyes. I got to go check on them and see if they're okay. And yet that's exactly what they're there for. They're actually there to see the stranger coming with puffy red eyes. And I realized that in our time, when we're experiencing such profound loneliness, and this was 10 years ago when I wrote this, when I gave this sermon, it was before COVID, which only exacerbated all of these trends. It was just after that sort of tipping point where everybody went on social media and we started to see this spike in loneliness, in social alienation, in depression, in suicidality, all the things that now Jonathan hates writing about, that we were a culture in crisis. And it occurred to me that when we're in this crisis, the last thing we want to do is face each other. And every bone in my body is pulling me into retreat from society, but I need to lean in. I need to lean toward community. I need to lean toward the brokenhearted. When I'm brokenhearted, I need to lean toward the people who can hold me with love. And so the sermon essentially was saying, in a time where we're living through what we're now calling an epidemic of crisis, of loneliness. At the time, I think we were calling it like a health crisis or something. The most important thing that we can do is turn to one another with love. And that sermon was not the book that I thought I was going to write. But I noticed that after I gave that sermon, our community was transformed. And it was like immediate. I mean, we could feel it in the room that night. It was Kol Nidre. And everyone was just like, we were in it together. After that night, people just started showing up for each other, like showing up at Shiva, showing up at the hospital, showing up and, after someone gives birth, like like the most incredible ways. And then I was traveling and I would give different talks, but every time I gave this talk, people would stay to talk about it. And it was my agent, actually, my book agent, who said to me, he very persistently pursued me for like a decade saying, what's your book? What's your book? I know you have a book in you. And I finally wrote down some outline for a book. And he said, this book's fine, but the book you should really write is that sermon. That sermon needs a deep dive. And that's the book that I think that we need to put out into the world right now. So that's the origin story.
I want to go a little further on that transformational moment that you described. Like, so your book is really this very passionate argument and that is also supported by a lot of stories, right? You tell a lot of really powerful stories. For this basic idea, I think that showing up, right, is an obligation. And you reference that the language of obligation, of duty, of responsibility, those are very, very strong. And clearly something happened after you gave that sermon, and you describe your community as one where it's like really internalized that notion of responsibility. And I think there's even a quote that I wrote down, like, presence was not an option, it was a moral and spiritual obligation, right? That was describing your community. And yet I think that idea of, like, you're really describing mitzvah as commandment, right? That, like, it is mitzvah is commandment, mitzvah is duty, mitzvah is obligation. I think that can often be challenging for a lot of people, especially people who might be hungry for some type of cognitive meaning, or like they want to understand, they want the nishma, not just the naaseh. They want to understand and not only do. So I want to invite you to reflect a little more on, like, how it is you went about, or you feel like the community went about inculcating that sense of duty, obligation, responsibility, because those are also, by the way, words that I think are, deeply, we're in deep need of them. And I speak as somebody who went to, like, I went to an Orthodox rabbinical school. I have no problem speaking that language. It's something like I get, but I also think, I'm really struck by it. So I just want to invite you to reflect on that a little bit more.
Well, for the people who need it, the science bears out the Torah. So, I mean, we now know that people who go to church or synagogue or mosque weekly are likely to live 7 years longer than they would than people who don't. We know that, I just heard this incredible study from a Harvard professor that Black folks who go to church weekly will live 13 years longer than Black folks who don't go to church. I mean, the data is actually bearing out what we know from the reality of from what Torah offers and what we see, right? So for some people, they'll be drawn to the data, but I don't think that people actually show up because the data says this is what's going to help you live a longer life. I think that people are hungry for meaning. I think that our time is a time in which everything feels like it's upside down, and people are searching deeply for a sense of purpose, for a sense of meaning, for a sense of connection, and for a sense of holiness. And one day, Josh, I actually was walking in Jerusalem, and I had this sudden awareness. It's the most obvious thing, but I never had thought of it before, which is the very structure of a bracha for Jews. The formula for a blessing is asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, that you make us holy when you ask something of us. Right? It's only when you ask something of me that I feel that I become holy. And I realized that we as human beings have a need to be needed. Mm-hmm. Right. And when people say, I'm expecting this of you, that is an expression of love, or it can be an expression of love. So when I say to my community, this is a moral and spiritual obligation, that this family that suffered this tragic loss needs our presence, the community's grateful because now they know that they're needed somewhere. And so I think that there's been decades in the Jewish world of attempting to address what was called the continuity crisis, back when I was in seminary, by asking less of people, saying like, it's okay. And when you come, we're grateful and we'll give it to you for free. But instead, we know that when people can engage in a rigorous practice, that practice means more to them. When people are asked, when we say, this is what's expected of you when you're in this environment, we ask this of all of the people who are part of ICAR, or all of the people who are part of this co-op or part of this community, that people actually feel seen and feel dignified by their presence in some way. So I saw that in our community, which is really has a very wide spectrum of engagement, from, I would say, totally previously Jewishly disengaged to Shomer Shabbos. We have a lot of rabbis, a lot of PhDs in Talmud, walking around the community, and a lot of first timers, that everybody resonated to this call for different reasons. And also, aside from what Torah asks of us, and aside from what the data bears out, there's just the human reality, which is every one of us has had a moment in our lives, or will, when we're walking to the left. And we know what it feels like when we are received with love from people who are walking in the other direction. When people show up, my friend Greg flew from New York to Los Angeles for 6 hours after my father died to be at Shiva with us. I will remember that for the rest of my life. That is terrible for his carbon footprint and phenomenal for our friendship, right? I will never forget that he did that, because and I kept saying thank you. And he's like, you're not supposed to thank people for coming to Shiva, right? Like, he's there because he loves us and he wants to be present with us. We all have those people who showed up and for whom when their presence helped us heal in the hardest moments, or even just helped us breathe through the hardest moments. And we all have the people who didn't show up, who we needed and did not come. And we know how painful that is. So even if you don't believe the data coming out of Harvard and you don't believe the Torah, you still can believe the human experience, which is, we know that it makes a difference when we're there. And while people are utterly terrified to walk into a Shiva, to a house of mourning, almost always when we walk out, we can say almost universally, like, I'm so glad that I just did that I just did that visit. That was hard, but I know that it mattered.
Yeah. There was a question that came in from someone named Allie, just about how in a lot of communities that burden, of the being present falls on the clergy, and it's so hard for that then to take root sometimes in the rest of the community.
Yeah.
Right. And it sounds to me, Sharon, like, part of it was like you were able to attract like a group of people where this would take root. Part of it was like there was the air cover of saying, I'm going to deliver this powerful message, right? And I'm going to use my pulpit, like, literally to establish this as a cultural norm. My guess is also you invested a lot of, I know from the book also, you invested a lot of yourself personally, which I think every rabbi does. And then there was something about that was able to then, transform into or take root quickly in the rest of the community, where it was like maybe they were seeing it reflected back from you of like, yeah, how important this is, and frankly, how, ultimately how good on a deeper level it feels, right, to show up.
Yeah. And also, I mean, Allie's totally right about this. Here's something that I love about this ritual. The people who go there and turn to the left, the people who go into that sacred place with their broken hearts, are not going there to be blessed by the rabbis. They are not going there to be blessed by the Kohanim, by the priests. They're actually going to receive a blessing from the other people who are there. We all have the capacity to give blessing to one another, and we don't use that superpower enough. And so I've done this exercise now a few times. We did it once at ICAR when we launched the book here in the community. And in some ways, somebody said to me today, I feel like your book is a love letter to the rabbinate, like sort of helping people understand what it means to be a rabbi, and kind of the only thing we can really give people is our love, right? Like, this is what it means for me to offer my love to you in your hardest moments and in your moments of joy. But I also think of it as a love story between me and my community in many ways. And I really wanted to lift up the names of a lot of the people in the community who have taught me so much. And also the names of people who've died, who I want to help them, be known in the world. These beautiful humans whose lives were cut short. But I brought the ritual to the community when we had the book launch. And so there were maybe 700 people who were there in the room that night, and we had a book talk. And then I just thought, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to take this risk. And I asked everyone to get up. And then the people who were doing okay that night, who really felt like they had a little bit of strength in them, to go to the perimeter of the room and start circling counterclockwise around the room. And then I said, if you're like me and you're in a vela, you're a mourner, or you're sick with worry, or you're brokenhearted in some way, I want to invite you to walk with me clockwise. And we all went to the perimeter of the room and we did this ritual. And the people encountered each other, and people I didn't even know stopped and looked in my eyes and said to me, Malach, tell me what happened to you. How's your heart? Mm-hmm. And I said, like, my dad died just before Rosh Hashanah this year. I'm a pulpit rabbi. My shloshim was cut short. My grieving period was cut short because of Rosh Hashanah. And I kept saying, I'm going to grieve acharei chagim, like after the chagim or after the holidays are over, I'll grieve. And then Simchat Torah, October 7th. And so I said this to people. I said, like, I feel so sad. I feel like I'm losing my opportunity to grieve this year because there's so much collective sorrow that I'm holding. And people blessed me. I felt the power of this ritual, and so did hundreds of people. And afterwards, one of my rabbis was in the room, and he said, Sharon, we just reenacted a ritual that has not been engaged for 2,000 years. Literally, like, this is our ancestors did this ritual. And we just kind of brought this very ancient thing and made it alive again. And it still works. Like, the power of it is still here. And so since then, I've brought this to, like, to my board, to my staff, to, like, we're doing this in small circles, sometimes getting up and walking around the room, and sometimes just going around the table. I was with a group of college students, progressive social justice activists, Jewish leaders on campus who are, like, right at the intersection that is most painful right now. And we sat around the table and I asked them, Malach, and they answered, like, tell me about your heart. And then they answered. And then I blessed them. And I said, I'm going to give blessings to the first two, but then after that, the rest of you are giving the blessings to each other. So someone asks, someone answers, and someone else blesses. And we just engaged this ritual for 2 hours, and people cried and shared stories. Like, there is such incredible power here. And it's not just the rabbis who have the power to see one another and also to offer blessings to one another. And that's something that every one of us has the capacity for.
I was on a retreat. Actually, before I share this, a few people have messaged me directly, and I want to tell you, I need to keep my focus on Sharon. If you want to send a question, please send it to Q&A. That's in the chat. So, but I was on a retreat this past Shabbat. We were running a retreat through IJS, and at Shabbat dinner, Rabbi Miriam Margles, a member of our core faculty, we had just done Kiddush, and it was a chance, that's a moment for blessing, of course. We do Kiddush. And normally, those of us who have children, there's a tradition to bless our children. But Miriam invited us into something very similar to what you're describing. And this is another opportunity, right, that all of us, I think, can do in our homes, which was that turn to a neighbor, and you're each going to have a turn to ask for what is the thing that you need a bracha for? Like, what do you need a blessing for right now? And to really look in that person's eyes and tell them, the other person's going to look in your eyes and really hear it. And then they're going to, they could take your hand if you want, but, like, then to offer you that blessing. And it was so beautiful. I was sitting next to Rabbi Jonathan Kliegler, and we just were able to, I told him what I needed in that moment and what I was asking for a bracha, and he gave that to me, and he told me, and, and there was crying, and it was beautiful. And it's like, so many of us, I think, go through Shabbos dinner, and it's like, it doesn't have that. It doesn't have that. I mean, there's a certain magic you get on retreat and being in a beautiful natural setting and with loving people and all of that. But we can make these ritual moments, all the time, to show up for each other. So, I love the description that you're offering. I want to shift to a different question. So this is the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, as you know, and one of the features of my job is that as a result of that, I get asked very frequently, "What is spirituality? Like, what do you mean by that?" And in the main effect, you really use the term spiritual a lot. You used it in this conversation. You talk about Ikar, wanting Ikar to awaken our generation's spiritual and moral imagination. You write that at one point. So I'd love to hear you reflect on what spirituality and spiritual imagination are, whether and how they might differ. I don't know if they do from morality or moral imagination. But yeah, I'd just like to hear your reflection on that.
I would love to hear your answer to this too. So maybe you can share
Okay.
yours as well. So I believe that the goal of the spiritual life is to be able to look at another human being and see the image of God. And so what that does is it heightens the necessity for a kind of deeply human encounter with the divine in each other, to see and to be seen by another in a not in an Instagram influencer way, but in a very deeply human way, so deep that we are given a glimpse of each other's divinity. And maybe that's what happened with you at Shabbat dinner, right? That some part of your inner life was revealed to somebody who you knew would hold it tenderly. And when you let him see you and he then saw you, that is a spiritual moment. Spiritual. Now, how does that differ from morality and moral obligation? They're very connected, but the moral obligation is the way that we, I think, enact the vision of a world worthy of that kind of spiritual connection, of the spiritual being that we've just encountered. So when I talk about awakening our moral imagination, what I'm really asking is, if we really took seriously that all people are created in God's own image, I mean, all people created in God's own image, that there's something holy inside of each person, which if we allowed ourselves a spiritual connection, we would be able to see. What kind of moral landscape must we build in order to allow both for those experiences and encounters to happen, but also for people to live in a way that's worthy of those who are created in God's own image? And so those two ideas are connected, but they're different from one another.
Yeah.
And I think that in really profound spiritual moments, those are the moments where I'm actually able to see God's presence in another, and I suppose theoretically also in myself, and also in nature and in the world. And so I remember learning years ago from one of my teachers about prayer, that the goal of prayer, it's like a triangle where there's the person who's leading over here, and there's the community over here, and then there's God up here. And all of these lines need to be kind of electric, that everything needs to be activated. The Shaliach Tzibor with the community, the prayer leader with the community and with God, God with the prayer leader and with the community, et cetera, et cetera. And I had this different vision as he was speaking, in which it's the same 3 points, except what's happening is the Shaliach Tzibor starts to sing or to invite into meditation or to invite into prayer. And the community meets that person in a person-to-person spiritual encounter that allows them both to rise up and connect with something divine. That it's kind of, we're each other's bridge to the divine.
It strikes me. I'll respond to your question. It just struck me though, that you're in the same city for a year or two more as Gustavo Dudamel, and I was a musician and orchestra conductor before all of this, and and I often think about the prayer experience that you're describing in those kind of musical terms, and I was like, I wonder if you and Dudamel have ever had a conversation about that, because the way that he approaches making music, I think, is very similar to what I hear you're describing. So. Anyway,
if you want to make an email intro, I'm happy to.
You probably have better connections than I do. I think to respond to your question, so the bumper sticker that I've come up with is our spirituality is like, this is the shortest version. Our spirituality is our capacity for feeling profoundly at home in the universe. When we experience that deep sense of belonging and at homeness, right? That's our spiritual muscle. That's our spirituality working. And I think then that's the ground from which, you know, interconnection and mutual recognition and creating a home for ourselves is creating a home for the divine presence. When we are being present, we are revealing the divine presence, and we're experiencing that within ourselves and with each other, right? And so, I think you're absolutely right. That moment of blessing, you know, on Friday night that I experienced was a feeling of being, you know, deeply at home, even though I was away from home. I actually prefaced Kiddush that night by saying, normally you have to pay me a lot of money to go away from home for Shabbos because I love being home with my family for Shabbos. But like being at home in that kind of setting, you know, having Shabbat, it's like, yes, okay, I'm here. Like I'm totally here. I'm totally present. And the Shekhinah is with us, right? The divine presence is also with us. So
I love that. I love that. And I mean, I just to connect it back to your question about how the spiritual imagination meets the moral imagination. What would it mean if we took seriously that our obligation as Jews and as human beings is to create a world in which all people felt that they were truly at home in the universe, in which all human beings could flourish in that way?
yeah. Amen. I'll give you that. The name of the book. Let's say it. Let me just check here. Okay. I'm going to ask you, I want to ask you a question about where we are in the life of society, this, especially American society, but I think we're seeing it all over the world. You talked in chapter 1 at one point about this experiment on monkeys that was memorable to me. I think it was in Italy because you described the guy going out to get gelato, right?
Gelato, yeah.
Right. So it's like this researcher is observing these monkeys, and then the guy goes out to get gelato, he comes back and he's eating his ice cream, and the monkeys are like smiling basically and like happy, even though they're not tasting the ice cream, but it was like vicariously they were eating the ice cream, or they were experiencing joy because this researcher, this human, their person, was experiencing joy. And you extrapolated out of that, you wrote, the act of witness was enough to stimulate their experience as if they themselves had eaten.
Mm-hmm.
And as I read that passage, I was wondering, like, how is it that despite that hardwiring, right, to delight in this enjoyment that others will have, to like delight in their joy, we seem to be living in this age, like Frank Bruni just came out with a book about the age of grievance, right? We seem to be living in this time, or age of envy, that we're in this moment when there's so much in the culture that seems built on grievance and envy, and not in being joyful at others' joy. And I wonder about, how does that innate capacity for vicarious joy, how does that become like warped into grievance?
What a great question. Okay, I'm thinking of a few things. One is the algorithm.
Yeah.
So and this is influenced by, right now I'm reading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxiety Generation. Is that what it's called?
We'll have him on next year. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's no question that this technology is rewiring us in ways that are profoundly unhealthy. And you know, I hinted at this earlier, but there's been this sort of he's making the argument that there's been this steady level of anxiety and loneliness in society over generations. And then all of a sudden around the world in the year 2010, and then really 2010 to 2015, there's just this spike in anxiety and depression and loneliness and social alienation and isolation. So, I mean, it obviously correlates to the moment that we all got these things in our hands that we can't even be, more than a couple inches away from at all times, and the messages that are being sent to us. Okay. So the way that I think that this plays out here is we have to talk about tribalism for a moment, which is there is this, I mean, I do think that we are naturally empathic creatures, that we, when somebody bangs their knee, somebody else cringes. Like, but there's a reason that we go like this when we're watching on TV and we see something terrible happen, or when we watch a terrible news report, and our bodies show that we're grieving with whoever's experiencing that. It's a fleeting moment, but it's a signal to us that we are actually connected to each other. But we also know that we have far past our capacity to feel, because we're in contact with too many people and too much pain. And there's a professor named Paul Slovic, who I cite him in the book. He writes fascinating studies at University of Oregon. And many years ago, I came across some of his work on psychic numbness, and the idea that the more pain we're exposed to, the less we feel at all. And so, and the way that he does this, there's this really interesting studies called the Rokia studies, where he went around campus showing a picture of one small girl, a child starving in Mali. And he said, would you give $5 to help feed this starving child? And basically everybody said yes to that, because who wouldn't give $5 to save a starving child? And then he zoomed out the picture. So it was Rokia and her brother. And he went around the campus and said, would you give $5 to help these two starving children? And the numbers were cut in half. And then he zoomed out more, and there's basically 200 starving children. And he said, would you give $5 to help these starving children? And almost nobody gave. Then took away the picture and just put the stats, and nobody gave at all. So like, what we know is that we've reached the saturation point and then some. And when that happens, we don't just say, well, I'll still give the same $5. Maybe it'll help a little bit. We don't give at all. So we're shutting ourselves down because we're overwhelmed by the amount of, it's like information overload. And then there's this reactive element, which is, but our hearts are still carrying hearts. So we can't shut out completely. So instead, what we'll do is we'll create these small tribal connections where we'll have a kind of hyper connectivity to the people inside our tribe. And that's also very natural. That's biological, right? Where we feel profoundly responsible to those people who we identify as part of our tribe. But we now also know that the deeper our connection to those inside our tribe, the more disconnect we feel, and even hostility to people who are outside our tribe. So like, this science is explaining the moment that we're experiencing right now, right? We are on total saturation when it comes to human suffering, but some people will turn off totally, but many people will say, I'm only going to focus on the pain of my tribe. And that's a good thing, except for the fact that the more we focus on the pain of our tribe, the less we can see the people who are outside of our tribe. And then you have protest, counter protest, everybody's screaming, and the whole world is breaking right now. And so the question is, like, how can we actively counter these trends, given the realities of what we have access to sort of slow down, to open our hearts a little bit more than they're naturally inclined to be open right now, and actually see the humanity in the people who are walking in a different direction from us. And in fact, most of the book, I'm dealing with the people who are walking to the right, and the people who are walking to the left, who are bereaved, bereft, and ill, as I said before. Mm-hmm. But in the 8th chapter of the book, the last chapter, I talk about what happens when the person who's coming toward you is less coming toward you and maybe coming at you. Someone whose ideas or actions in the world may really be hurtful to you, may have hurt people who you love. How are you supposed to engage those people? And I think what I'm asking of us, and I think what our ancient rabbis are really demanding of us, is that we're able to lift our eyes and see their humanity too, even when they're coming from a totally different direction, a totally different vantage point, and instead say to them, instead of turning away from them or ignoring them or pretending that you're not on my team, then I can't see you at all, or I see you as my enemy. Instead, learning how to quietly open our hearts to one another and say, Tell me about your heart. What do you see from your vantage point? Because it's different from what I see from mine. And I know that I'm in anguish. I can only imagine that you too are in anguish right now. So instead of meeting each other like gladiators, can we meet each other like two brokenhearted, full of sorrow, people out out in a courtyard, just trying to complete our own circle? And what happens when we reorient in that way? What do we see when we actually allow ourselves to look at one another?
Yeah. It occurs to me listening to that. I mean, I don't think there's not much translation that what we need to do to apply that to the American political context or to the Israeli, is intra-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian context. And we can go there if we want. But one thing that just occurred to me listening to you describe the ritual one more time was also realizing, we have the line from Isaiah that we say, as part of the high holiday liturgy all the time, right? Ki veti v'tfilah yikareh l'chol ha'amim, that, this vision that the Beit HaMikdash would be this place, the temple would be this place that it wouldn't just be Jews, it would be anybody, right? People who need to come can come. And it occurs to me, in that throng of people moving either clockwise or counterclockwise, who's checking tzitzis? Nobody's checking if this person is Jewish, right? They're just actually, you could have just people. Obviously it's a Jewish ritual. Obviously most of the people who are there are going to be Jews, but there's probably plenty of people who aren't, right? And who are along because they're moved and they want to be there, and they're in just as much pain or need of blessing or wanting to give blessing or etc. as anybody else.
That's right. And I want to build out let me say two things about that. One, it's a metaphor, right? I mean, while we at Ikar actually enacted the thing, and you can do that. I mean, you can do that at your dinner table, your Shabbos table, you can do it in your boardroom, but it's really a metaphor, because we can make any place the Beit HaMikdash now. We can make the supermarket the Beit HaMikdash. Like, what does it mean when somebody's coming toward you and they're crying? Do you pretend you don't see them? Or do you say, hey, are you okay? Do you want to talk? Is there something in your heart that you want to share? So, this happened to me, by the way, just the other day. I was in shul and there was someone who I'd never seen before, who was in the back and was crying. And someone came over to me and said, there's a woman who's really broken up and I don't know what to do. And so I went over to her to say, do you want to talk? Do you want to tell me about your heart? And we went into the back room and she told me that she had just lost her cousin, who's Israeli and who's 22, studying robotics. He just died. And she came to shul like she'd never been before, but she came because she was looking for some way to make meaning out of her grief. So we can avoid that person who's coming toward us, or we can go toward them, and we don't need the Beit HaMikdash to hold us anymore. And so we can make any place the Beit HaMikdash in Jewish fashion. So certainly it applies to people who aren't Jewish. Like, it's not, this isn't just, but the other thing is I want to just there's a really interesting textual detail in the Mishnah that helps us understand what I think is a very important point about the people who are coming at us, coming from the other direction. The category that describes those folks is the menudeh. This is a person was put in nidui. It was a very specific form of punishment in the ancient world, which is one step short of excommunication. So someone was put into nidui for a relatively contained period of time, in which people socially distanced from them. You weren't supposed to go within 6 feet of them. You're not supposed to have them for Shabbos dinner. You're not supposed to engage them in any real way. And the hope is that this distancing awakens the desire for tshuva, makes them want to repair whatever they've broken. Somebody has to have done something pretty terrible to be put into that kind of punishment in the ancient world. So, but even those people who we don't engage, if we saw them on the steps going up to the Temple Mount, we would not greet them. Mm-hmm. But when we're inside that courtyard, we see them, we ask them with curiosity, we hold them with love, we give them blessings. Okay. I think that's astonishing and amazing. We don't do that for the people who've been excommunicated, though. Meaning, this is one step short. The menudeh is one step short. Someone who's caused great harm. but we don't allow into that space the excommunicated. The people who've done worse, the people who would blow up the Temple Mount don't get to go into the Temple Mount. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, there are some people who their very presence in the shared space, whether that shared space is your synagogue or your church or your supermarket, actually endangers the other people who are there. And we are not called to engage them in this ritual in the same way. I think if you can, we still should. And I think that that's part of the, one of the great challenges of our time, but only if we can do so safely. And it feels to me, Josh, like part of the question that we need to ask ourselves in this time is, does this person make me unsafe, or does this person make me uncomfortable? And if they make me unsafe, it's not actually my obligation to risk my life to sit with them. But if they make me uncomfortable, I think it is our obligation. I think that our humanity depends on seeing their humanity, even if their views or their Instagram posts or even their actions make us feel profoundly uncomfortable. We're still called to see them as human beings created in the image of God, worthy of our curiosity and our compassion.
So I think that sets us up for the last question that we have time for tonight, because we're gonna run out of time. And there've been a few other questions that have come in. I'm sorry we haven't been able to manage all of them. It's always hard because it's such a good conversation, but we're doing our best. I think that discernment that you're describing, I 110% agree on that line. There's some place between unsafety and discomfort, right? Lack of safety and lack of comfort. And I think a lot of us are sort of minding, like, where is that line? And some of it is so subjective, right? It's really like, well, who's to say what is objectively unsafe versus uncomfortable? You can gaslight somebody that way. Like, you don't want to do that. So part of the answer, it seems to me, I've been really thinking about the notion of habits of the heart that Tocqueville writes about. We could translate that poetically in Hebrew as avodah shebalev, right? That what are the spiritual practices of the heart that we have to engage in to live in this incredible experiment that we're in of democratic self-governance and in a multi polyglot diverse democracy. And so I guess what I want to invite you to reflect on a little bit more and share about are the internal spiritual practices that you have found that help you meet those kinds of moments, right, with curiosity rather than judgment, right? That help you be able to say, okay, I'm discerning here that, yeah, it's actually not unsafe. It's just uncomfortable. And you write very powerfully in that last chapter about some of those encounters. You say it's profound spiritual work. And so I want to ask you, what is happening in your heart, in your mind, in your body, in your neshama when you're doing that?
I write a little bit about this, but I actually envision a screen coming down from the ceiling, separating me from the person who is causing me pain or discomfort. And I'm now watching them on a screen. And it's enough of a shift for me. It's enough of a distancing from the reality of what's happening. I still cry when I watch movies, but I don't feel the personal pain the way I feel it when somebody's saying, you are worthless, you're a fraud. I don't, if I see someone saying that in a movie, I don't feel it as like an attack on my soul, the way I do when someone's sitting in my office and says it. Yes, that happens, by the way. So I try to envision the person who's hurting me on a screen, and it gives me the chance to be an objective observer instead of a wounded receptacle for their pain. And when I have a little bit more objectivity, I can start to get curious about what happened to them that made them hurt so much that they would want to hurt me. And it doesn't always work, but it often works. I really use this all the time. to be honest with you, like every day, it's like a cut to the left, a cut to the right, like, from the left, from the right, like every day. And it's so painful to be alive in the world right now. We're all experiencing this. And somebody said to me the other day, it's just so hard. It must be so hard to be a rabbi right now. I'm like, it's hard to be a human being right now. We're all experiencing this with our families, with our friends. Like everything we say is wrong. Everything we say is hurtful to someone, right? And so how do you continue to live? And so this is my equivalent of your pause behind your head. Just take a moment and try to become a learner. I quote in the book, my friend, Reverend Ed Bacon, the great Reverend Ed Bacon, who wrote a book also called I think it's the 8 Habits of Love. Speaking of de Tocqueville. And he says that in our lives, for every experience we have, we can either be a hero, we can be a victim, or we can be a learner. And the hero version is like, the victim, I always think of this example, like they lost my luggage. The victim version is like, oh, this happens every time I fly. And why me? And why does the worst thing always happen to me? And now I'm going to be 3 hours late to my meeting and I'm going to be in sneakers instead of my whatever. The hero version is like, they lost my luggage, but I kept my cool. I went right to the store. I bought a new pair of shoes and I went to my meeting and I survived. The learner version is like, this is the 6th time that this has happened to me. I'm going to go carry on, So the question is like, can we receive the world as learners or do we have to be victims? And so I've literally like done this again and again. I see this person, I hear him raging at me. He's full of grief and trauma like we all are right now. I wish he wasn't directing it at me, but I'm not going to take it in. Just because someone's offensive doesn't mean I have to be offended. And instead, I'm going to try to hold empathy toward this person and sympathy toward him because he's clearly holding so much that he can't control himself. And that has become a spiritual practice for me. And when it works, by the way, he doesn't deserve this. I'm just like, this is when I know you had talked to Rabbi Scheiheld recently, and he talks about grace. Grace is undeserved love, right? He does not deserve my compassion. I'm not doing it for him, though. I'm doing it for me. I don't want to get beat up by this guy spiritually, internally. I don't want my soul to be tarnished by his rage. So I am going to give myself the gift of compassion for him so that I don't have to be tortured by him. And I think, feel free to take that ritual if that helps. And then there's a metabolizing of the grief and the rage and sort of the exhale, the letting that out so that we don't. And my sister always says, if you don't metabolize it, it will metastasize in you. That hurt just grows and grows in us until it's all we can think about. So then just letting ourselves release it after we're done with the compassionate exercise that he didn't deserve. So it doesn't have to live in us anymore. That's what I try to practice literally multiple times a day now.
I have a conversation with Mark Margolius about the Tikkun Midot practice, developing our character traits that he teaches. We're out of time, but this has been such an amazing conversation, and I would love to go for another hour. And maybe the next time I'm in LA, we'll go get coffee because we also have to talk about Yitz Greenberg because we haven't talked about Yitz Greenberg,
Yes.
about whom I wrote my doctoral dissertation. But anyway. We're going to pause here. I'm going to bring Mark back on to close us out. And thank you so much. This has been really, really great.
Thank you. What a joy. Thank you.
Wow, what a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much, Rabbi Josh Fagelson, Rabbi Sharon Brous. We're going to put a link in the chat again for those who might be interested in purchasing The Amen Effect by Sharon. We also want to I want to thank on behalf of all of us, Andrew Schumann and Maydel Goodman Benamy and Molly Easton for organizing and holding this space tonight for us, organizing and holding this program for us tonight for all our benefits. And we want to thank each and every one of you for showing up, for being here. And we really hope that you'll join us on Tuesday night, June 4th, for our 4th annual Evening of Gratitude. And we look forward to seeing you then, if not sooner, on any of our programs. I want to say Lila Tov to everyone. Hope you have a good and safe night, and we'll see you soon. Be well.